Two things really drove the customer to support this new, fragmented supplier environment. Customers wanted to break IBM's grip on the economics of the industry, to rip apart IBM's pricing umbrella, which allowed it to bundle prices and achieve significantly high margins. The customer was increasingly interested in delivering computing power to individual employees. The term was distributed computing, in contrast to the mainframe's centralized computing. IBM was slow, very slow, in delivering distributed computing, and many small companies moved in to fill the gap. These companies were in no position to deliver an entire integrated solution, so they offered add-ons to the basic IBM system and built around IBM's central processing hub. This is clearly what Microsoft and Intel did when IBM reluctantly moved into the PC business. So it really wasn't that the customer desired a whole bunch of fragmented suppliers. The broad objective was to bring more competition into the marketplace and to seek suppliers for a new model of computing. And it worked. By the early 1990s there were tens of thousands of companies in the computer industry, many of which lived for a few months or years, then disappeared. But the impact of all this dynamism was lower prices and more choices, with the notable exception of the PC industry, where Microsoft recreated the IBM choke hold, only this time around it was in the desktop operating environment rather than in the mainframe computer. While there were good consequences to this fundamental reshaping of the computer industry, there was also one very undesirable outcome. The customer now had to be the integrator of the technology into a usable solution to meet his or her business requirements. Before, there was a general contractor called IBM or Burroughs or Honeywell. Now, in the new industry structure, the burden was on the customer to make everything work together. This was all complicated by the absence of uniform standards throughout the computer industry. Competitors in the computer industry, unlike any other industry I know, try to create unique standards that they own. They do not make it easy for other companies in the industry to connect with or understand these standards without extracting a huge price. Thus, there is a cacophony of standards and interconnect requirements that makes the creation of a single solution very difficult. I'll discuss this in more detail later. As a big customer of the information technology industry in the early 1990s, I knew firsthand that integration was becoming a gigantic problem. At American Express, our wallet-sized piece of plastic was going to be moving data all over the world, a fact which brought with it enormous technical challenges. All I wanted was an information technology platform and a partner that would allow me to run that business the way I wanted it to run. So when I arrived at IBM in 1993, I believed there was a very important role for some company to be able to integrate all of the pieces and deliver a working solution to the customer. Why? Because at the end of the day, in every industry there's an integrator. Sure, there are supply chains, and there are enterprises at various points in the chain that offer only one piece of a finished product: steel makers in the auto industry, component makers in consumer electronics, or providers of a marketing or tax application in financial services. But before the components reach the consumer, somebody has to sit at the end of the line and bring it all together in a way that creates value. In effect, he or she takes responsibility for translating the pieces into value. I believed that if IBM was uniquely positioned to do or to be anything, it was to be that company. Another myth that was playing out at the time was that the information technology, IT, industry was going to continue to evolve, or devolve, toward totally distributed computing. Everything was going to get more local, more self-contained, smaller and cheaper, until the point at which all the information in the world would be running on somebody's wristwatch. A lot of people had bought into the value of information democratization extended to its extreme, and they accepted the industry's promise that all the piece parts would work together, or, in the industry's term, interoperate. But even before I had crossed the threshold at IBM, I knew that promise was empty. I'd spent too long a time on the other side. The idea that all this complicated, difficult to integrate, proprietary collection of technologies was going to be purchased by customers who would be willing to be their own general contractors made no sense. Unfortunately, in 1993 IBM was rocketing down a path that would have made it a virtual mirror image of the rest of the industry. The company was being splintered, you could say it was being destroyed. Now, I must tell you, I am not sure that in 1993 I or anyone else would have started out to create an IBM. But, given IBM's scale and broad-based capabilities, and the trajectories of the information technology industry, it would have been insane to destroy its unique competitive advantage and turn IBM into a group of individual component suppliers, more minnows in an ocean. In the big April customer meeting at Chantilly and in my other customer meetings, CIOs made it very clear that the last thing in the world they needed was one more disk drive company, one more operating system company, one more PC company. They also made it clear that our ability to execute against an integrator strategy was nearly bankrupt and that much had to be done before IBM could provide a kind of value that we were not providing at the time, but which they believed only IBM had a shot at delivering: genuine problem-solving, the ability to apply complex technologies to solve business challenges, and integration. So keeping IBM together was the first strategic decision, and, I believe, the most important decision I ever made, not just at IBM, but in my entire business career. I didn't know then exactly how we were going to deliver on the potential of that unified enterprise, but I knew that if IBM could serve as the foremost integrator of technologies, we'd be delivering extraordinary value. As a result, we threw out the investment bankers who were arranging IPOs of all the pieces of the enterprise. We threw out the accountants who were creating official financial statements required in order to sell off the individual components. We threw out the naming consultants who had decided that the printer division should be called Pennant and the storage division AddStar. We stopped all the internal activities that were creating separate business processes and systems for each of these units, all of which were enormous drains of energy and money. For example, even in the midst of financial chaos, we had managed to hire more than 70 different advertising agencies in the United States alone. More on this later. Human resources people were willy-nilly changing benefits programs so that if an employee left one IBM business unit for another, it was like entering another country, with different language, currency, and customs. I began telling customers and employees that IBM would remain one unified enterprise. I remember that the response from our executive team was mixed: great joy from those who saw the company as being saved, and bitter disappointment from those who saw it breaking apart as their personal lifeboat to get off the Titanic. Changing our economic model. The second major decision that summer was to restructure IBM's fundamental economics. At the risk of sounding pompously tutorial, a profit-making business is a relatively simple system. You need to generate revenue, which comes from selling things at an acceptable price. You have to achieve a good gross profit on those sales. And you have to manage your expenses, which are the investments you make in selling, research and development, building plants and equipment, maintaining financial controls, developing and running advertising, and so on. If revenue, gross profit, and expenses are all moving in the right relationship, the net effect is growing profits and positive cash flow. Unfortunately, in IBM's case the relationships were all wrong. Revenue was slowing because the company was so dependent on the mainframe, and mainframe sales were declining. Gross profit margin was sinking like a stone because we had to reduce mainframe prices in order to compete. The only way to stabilize the ship was to ensure that expenses were going down faster than the decline in gross profit. Expenses were a major problem. After months of hard work, CFO Jerry York and his team determined that IBM's expense to revenue ratios, i.e., how much expense is required to produce $1 of revenue, was wildly out of range with those of our competitors. On average, our competitors were spending 31 cents to produce $1 of revenue, while we were spending 42 cents for the same end. When we multiplied this inefficiency times the total revenue of the company, we discovered that we had a $7 billion expense problem. Since the repositioning of the mainframe was a long-term challenge, and we had to reduce mainframe prices and thus our gross profit, the only way to save the company, at least in the short term, was to slash uncompetitive levels of expenses. So we made the decision to launch a massive program of expense reduction, $8.9 billion in total. Unfortunately, this necessitated, among other things, reducing our employment by 35,000 people, in addition to the 45,000 people whom John Akers had already laid off in 1992. That meant additional pain for everyone, but this was a matter of survival, not choice. Re-engineer how we did business. These early expense cuts were necessary to keep the company alive, but I knew they were far from sufficient to create a vibrant, ongoing, successful enterprise. We needed fundamental change in the way we carried out almost every process at IBM. All of our business processes were cumbersome and highly expensive. So in 1993 we began what ultimately became one of the largest, if not the largest, re-engineering projects ever undertaken by a multinational corporation. It would last a decade and, as it unfolded, change almost every management process inside IBM. Re-engineering is difficult, boring, and painful. One of my senior executives at the time said, "Re-engineering is like starting a fire on your head and putting it out with a hammer." But IBM truly needed a top-to-bottom overhaul of its basic business operations. Jerry York led the effort. By addressing some of the obvious excesses, he had already cut $2.8 billion from our expenses that year alone. Beyond the obvious, however, the overall task was enormous and daunting. We were bloated. We were inefficient. We had piled redundancy on top of redundancy.